My name is Emily Spieler, and it's my job to welcome you to the second panel, which focuses on the second area of Karl's transformative work. For those of you who don't know me, I came to Northeastern almost exactly 20 years ago as dean, and some of you actually know me from, some of the people here know me from when I was in the Women's Law Collective in Boston in the 70s. But leaving that aside, I've been Karl's colleague and fellow traveler in labor and employment law since I came here, teaching at, and maintaining a curriculum for law students and supporting the work of worker centers and unions in their quest to promote workers' rights in Boston and around the world. This panel is a panel that focuses on Karl's work that focused on about labor law, starting with the seminal article on the de-radicalization of the Wagner Act. And there will be 4 remarkable scholars, only one of whom had to stay home because of COVID. But first we will hear via video from Judge Silvana Schiada, who has known Karl for more than 30 years. She was the first woman elected by Parliament as a judge at the Italian Constitutional Court in 2014, after serving as a professor of labor law and European social law at the University of Florence and at the European University Institute. She's now an emeritus professor at the University of Florence. After we see her interview, her video, we will be hearing from 4 speakers, not in the order that you have in your flyer. First, from Michael Fishel, who's the professor of law at the University of Connecticut, began his legal career as an attorney with the NLRB, and after Reagan won the presidency, he escaped to academia at the University of Miami until he moved to UConn in 2006. He includes in his career highlights active participation in a faculty group supporting the ultimately successful effort of SEIU to organize the custodial and landscaping workers at the University of Miami. The second speaker will be Sanju Paul, who's an assistant professor of law at Wayne State. Prior to transitioning to the academy, she practiced law for several years, representing workers, labor unions, and civil rights plaintiffs, has written widely on issues of antitrust and labor, and broadly speaking, studies how law organizes economic coordination, currently focusing on labor and antitrust. We will then hear from Veena Dubal, professor of law at UC Hastings. Her research focuses on the intersection of law, technology, and precarious work. And within this broad frame, she does empirical research and uses critical theory to understand the impact of digital technologies and emerging legal frameworks on the lives of workers, the co-constitutive influences of law and work on identity, and the role of law and lawyers in solidarity movements. Joining us via Zoom will be Diamond Ashiagbor, who is professor of law at the University of Kent. Diamond is an interdisciplinary legal scholar who studies labor law, equality, trade and development, and economic sociology of law. She's a graduate of Oxford and European University Institute in Florence. Her most recent edited book was Reimagining Labor Law for Development, Informal Work in the Global North and South. I've suggested to the panelists who are here that they not come up until after we hear from Justice Schiada, and then we will come up here and speak from the table, and Diamond will speak at the end. And hopefully there will be plenty of time for conversation afterwards. Thank you.
Karl and dear friends, thank you for including me in this celebration. I feel part of this special gathering, which is a tribute to scholarship and to friendship. I have been thinking of the many occasions we have had to share thoughts and discuss projects, and I have been going back doing memories. Uh, and then doing this, I found in a folder in my apartment in Florence a paper Karl delivered in Rome in 1994, so we're going back a few years, at the Centro per la Riforma dello Stato. The title is Legal Practice and the Democratization of Society. You tried in that paper and many other occasions to explain to Italian lawyers the doctrine, the practice, and the theory of critical legal studies in the US. And Italian lawyers listening to you were people engaged in some form of democratic reforms. They were trying to enhance in Italian legal system. And I remember our long discussions on what riformismo means in Italian. I read those pages, Karl, and the enthusiasm and the honesty of your work is there. You write, among many other things in that paper, if you put any students in a room for political discussion, they would advance at least 4 or 5 different points of view. This is the solid ground on which you have built your work, dear Karl. Pluralism and constant challenges to combine coherence and open-mindedness. Let me recall your work in South Africa. You have inspired so many lawyers and so many friends and people there. They have been benefiting from your work and from your many advices. And let me mention the seminar we organized together at the European University Institute, again many years ago, with Boustros. I have a vivid memory of you in that seminar, and what a joy to enter the classroom with you, and then the discussion and the pleasure to discuss with you afterwards. Another vivid memory I have in my mind is of you and Hallie arriving in Florence, and of the time we spent together in those happy days. And a vivid memory of visiting your father in New York. A real privilege. Thank you for allowing me to do that. And also thank you for the strength you transmit to students. I know how much students love you. And thank you for keeping all your friends together today in such difficult times, for not losing hope and energy that you are so good in transmitting to other people. I often look at the picture of you and Hallie, and I feel close to you and confident we shall always be friends and discuss passionately as we have done in the past. And why not include some gossip in our conversations? We're there. Good luck to everybody, and a big hug to you all. Thank you.
Yeah. Are we short? Maybe. Oh, she's out. Okay, she just has to sit down.
That's the first time I've taken off a mask in a room with this many people in about 2 years and a month. Don't anybody breathe. No, you can breathe. It's okay. But it is a little unnerving. It's wonderful to be here. It's just amazing to be here, and I can't express enough gratitude to the organizers, to the dean, and especially to Karl for for this amazing occasion. Thrilled to be included. I want to use my time to tell two stories. The first set in 1976 at Harvard Law School. Second set in the 1990s and early aughts all over the world. And then I'll close with an epilogue that's focused on the current fraught yet remarkable moment in labor history. So the first story was the fall of 1976. And I can say firsthand, a thrilling time to be a lefty student at Harvard Law School. At the time, I would say, we came for the liberals, but stayed for something else altogether. Because there were these professors whose classes were just different. And the first sign of difference was that they assembled their own course materials, which meant no resale value whatsoever. Thanks a lot. And they often included readings from extra legal sources, and in any event, readings that creatively and energetically challenged what turned out to be the settled understandings that organized our more mainstream texts, which were all either brown or red. For another thing, inside and outside of class, they treated their students decently, generously even, and that was a welcome surprise to a generation of law students who had just seen Paper Chase before heading to law school. We arrived expecting crabby imperiousness and ritual humiliation, and we weren't disappointed. Not at all. If you want to know the details, one of our classmates wrote a book about it. It's sort of Son of Paper Chase, or 1L. But mostly the difference was a studied distance from the legal materials, a focus on critique rather than apologetics, or just doing my job, ma'am, doctrine preaching. We had Duncan Kennedy for contracts, where the rhetoric of legal justification was taken seriously but not literally. And the secrets of the realists, deeply repressed or snidely dismissed in our other classes, were revealed to our constant amazement and delight. Morty Horowitz for legal history, offering a powerful counterpunch to the steady liberal progress narrative served up in our other courses. Derek Bell for race, racism, and American law. She taught out of his just published casebook that sported a shot of the famous Black Power salute in the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City, and at least implicitly said that he was going to be as critical of the notion of civil as he was of the notion of rights. And then Unger for jurisprudence, where the smallest unit of analysis was advanced Western capitalist democracies. And where at any moment we were half expecting a divine reply to the question he provocatively posed at the end of Knowledge and Politics. Critical legal studies wasn't even a thing yet, let alone had it been thingified. But a relentlessly critical and decidedly unapologetic study of law was infiltrating the citadel. And both the school of thought and the social movement were rapidly coalescing, even as we students researched our third-year papers and prepped for another set of exams. And then came the buzz about a paper that had been presented by a recent graduate at a faculty workshop. Mostly we students didn't hear a lot about faculty workshops, didn't even know they existed. This one broke the seal. Paper in question had energized the soon-to-be crits and driven other faculty into a flurry of memo writing. Professor Bell was so impressed with the paper that he set aside his course plan to enthuse about it at length and to persuade those of us fortunate enough to be in his class to be sure to read it. And the research and teaching assistants who were working with the usual suspects. We got the details and spread the word further. And the paper was the judicial de-radicalization of the Wagner Act and the origins of modern legal consciousness. The recent graduate was Karl Klare. And for those of us who study and teach the subject labor law, it's not been the same since. In a nutshell, he pulled back the curtain on the normal science of labor law, revealing patterns of ideological conflict and contestation behind the judicial declarations of doctrinal constraint and fidelity to congressional purpose. Judicial de-radicalization, like other first-gen CLS work, posed a deep and daunting challenge to the received tradition of largely technical studies sprinkled with well-meaning policy talk, inspiring those of us who entered the academy in its wake to search every nook and cranny of our subject for the hidden and not so hidden politics of law. But among a significant group of students at the time, the paper inspired a deep interest in labor law, produced a series of workshops and informal study sessions. Kathy Stone was a year ahead of me, and she was a principal organizer. Ed James, who had worked for the mine workers, was a participant as well. The highlight workshop was one where the author of the paper came and turned out to be a wonderful and inspiring presence. Whatever else those gatherings produced, they inoculated all of us against the risk of taking labor law from Archibald Cox. In my own case, the paper and the conversations it produced, and most of all, the deep humanity and intellectual generosity of the author inspired me to a career in labor law, enabling me to spend a half-decade as an appellate lawyer for the NLRB and also with the California Agricultural Labor Relations Board, working to secure justice for employees fired for union organizing. Second story, fast forward to the mid-1990s and the story of a critical legal movement that flourished in the decades following the supposed death of critical legal studies, the crash of the mothership. The name of this movement was INTEL, the International Network of Transformative Employment and Labor Law. But in terms of ideas, energy, and many of the participants, it was CLS reloaded. And over the course of a decade, beginning in the mid-90s, we held a series of extraordinary conferences in Canterbury, Coral Gables, Cape Town, Toronto, Catania, and Kyoto. We published a pair of groundbreaking collections, including Labor Law in an Era of Globalization, Transformative Practice and Possibilities. Karl made us promise never to say the first part without the transformative practices and possibilities part. The other collection, Labor Law, Work and Family. And we spawned a host of cross-pollinating collaborations, mini conferences, group email threads, academic visits, friendships, and conversations. There were four remarkable features of this critical network. Hold on one second. Thank you so much. Marco Rubio was a student at the University of Miami, and I learned how to drink water. So 4 remarkable features of this critical network. The first remarkable feature was, it was the first truly sustained international labor dialogue with active participants from Europe, the Middle East, the Americas, Africa, Asia. What we had in common, in addition to deep commitments to critical legal work, to workplace justice, and to sorting out just what was happening to our field, was that every one of us was a friend of Karl, who had carefully cultivated scholarly engagements and friendships throughout the world. Turned out, as I saw from the first panel, he was seeing other people. This is really not the way I would hope to find out, but we will always have parrots. The second remarkable feature of this conference was we didn't have any money. Actually, turned out to be a metaphor for my life. It was Lookman, no funding, and it was all homemade. And what we would do one at a time is talk our deans into, we're going to have some friends over, and then convincing them to pay the $30,000 bill when the conference was over. So it can be done. The third remarkable feature was a feminist revolt at the first meeting that eliminated for the rest of the project the usual tendency toward white male dominance. It was an extraordinary moment that could have exploded the whole project, but instead what happened is some people went away and others learned to behave better. And so the kind of decorum that Lucy was describing on the first panel was also very much decorum. The fourth remarkable feature is its provenance as self-critique. Karl had already inspired one transformation of labor law scholarship with judicial de-radicalization, together with other first-gen critical labor scholars like Kathy Stone and Alan Hyde. That work dramatically shifted the preoccupations, not just of left, but also of mainstream labor law scholarship for a decade and then some. But as innovative and invigorating as the new work was, the revelations of one generation inevitably take for granted understandings and assumptions ripe for interrogation by the next. And it turned out that even the best labor scholarship of the 80s and the 90s was operating largely within frames that were problematic from the get-go, and that were in any event already under assault by economic, cultural, and political developments, soon collectively to be known as globalization. So what was remarkable is that Karl energetically organized a challenge to the very work he had begun and inspired, as Intel undertook a relentless exploration of some of the most fundamental concepts in the labor field, interrogating the concepts of work, of worker, of workplace, of employment, challenging the distinctions between paid and unpaid work, between employment and unemployment, between employment and self-employment, and between work and other essential life activities. And undertaking this rethinking nearly a decade before others noticed, and nearly 2 decades before the insights that the work, much of the work yielded, became conventional wisdom among progressive legal thinkers. So that brings me to the epilogue. Turns out that the most dramatic influence of all on labor law happened in the classroom. For decades, progressive labor lawyers and scholars have been critiquing the National Labor Relations Board, the agency charged with enforcing the country's labor laws, and lamenting its snail-paced procedures, legalistic interpretations, and toothless remedies. While we were doing all that lamenting, 2 remarkable labor lawyers and a generation of their peers were hard at work devising creative strategies based on deep understandings of law on the books as well as the law in action. And as a result, their work has begun to exceed by far the hopes of the lamenters. Fortunately for the development of labor law, Presidents Obama and Biden saw fit to appoint each of them as general counsel to the National Labor Relations Board. Richard Griffin was Obama's second general counsel, and Jennifer Abruzzi is as of now, President Biden's general counsel. There's a challenge to that in federal court. We'll save that for another day. Richard was Karl's student, and Jennifer was a student of someone who became a labor lawyer and scholar in large measure because of Karl's example. And there's no greater honor for a life in teaching than to watch our students accomplish things we couldn't even have imagined for the field we love. Their work offers a greater possibility in the moment than at any other point in my lifetime of delivering on the core promise of the Wagner Act, which asked not what the law could do for workers, but what workers could do for and with each other, with the law poised to challenge obstructions to those efforts, particularly obstructions posed by recalcitrant employers wielding power that is still very much the product of the common law of master and servant, and with the law poised to play a critical role in generating community and official support for those efforts. As recent events at a sprawling warehouse on Staten Island attest, talk about of all the gin joints at all the towns. The potential energy of solidaristic collective action should not be misunderestimated. And the importance of the work of our students and a new generation of labor lawyers and academics in enabling and in reinforcing the release of all that energy shouldn't be underestimated either.
We want it used
Okay,
because of
Okay.
there's so many people watching on Zoom.
No problem.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sanju Paul, and I'm really, really honored to be here. And I really appreciaed hearing some of the real-time developments Una and I were discussing, that we were not there for that, but we too, I think, feel and can feel the reverberations of how something that it's very evident was not common sense at the time has become common sense, has become sort of the water we swim in as scholars today. And so it's just an incredible honor to participate in this conversation, even if I can't speak to some of the same things that Professor Fishel did. So I think I'm going to pick up on a couple of things in the paper and then relate them a little bit to some of the research I've been doing. And then maybe we can talk in the Q&A a little bit, or maybe I'll tee up a little bit, these questions of methods that Karl has also participated, in currently in these debates that are happening in the LPE world. So perhaps we can talk about that as well. So just, rereading the paper for the judicial de-radicalization paper for today, I think that there's, maybe this, again, seems very obvious now, but as he says in the paper, taking the relatively autonomous dimension of legal consciousness, legal institutions, and legal practices, kind of charting this middle path between reducing it all to external social and political realities, and then obviously also avoiding the formalism and the conceptualism. So I think, this is what I try to aspire to do, and I think many of us aspire to do, and this really is, an inspiration in attempting to do that. So. And I guess two elements of that too that I'll draw out, that the law is not simply reducible to external social and political forces. It's obviously constitutive of them in part, and that these subversions of some of the big aims of the Wagner Act, we might also say the Sherman Act. We've seen it in other instances as well. Isn't a plot or conspiracy, he says in the paper. And he then, in then following this through the paper, generates a new history. It's not just important in labor law, it's important for historians, that charts a middle course between, this naive progressive historiography that he describes and this, tell me if I'm getting this right, and this more reductive corporate liberalism thesis. So that's how I read it. And so I then wanted to maybe talk a little bit about how I try to apply this method in labor and antitrust. And I think what I want to say is like we could identify, using the same method, a kind of structural genetic defect in the New Deal settlement, including the Wagner Act, even prior to the stage that Karl talks about in the paper, and fully taking on the big potential and democratic and egalitarian aspirations of the act, not negating that at all. But even prior to the judge-made interpretations. And I want to describe this genetic defect not in terms of capital, not in terms of property rights, not in terms of the employer, which I think is actually the use of which in labor law, I think actually tends to reify this thing that I think is a genetic defect. And that is something that I call the firm exemption, that there is this, I started calling it the firm exemption, focusing on antitrust law, where we talk all the time about the labor exemption, right? But there's also a big firm exemption in antitrust law, but really it's a trans-substantive legal common sense that I think we can argue that starting in the progressive era, I'll say a little bit more about that, but then in the New Deal settlement in particular, that we have a kind of hierarchy of economic coordination. Law organizes economic coordination. It allocates coordination rights, right, from the ground up. And it was not the case in the anti-monopoly period, for example, in the populist period, if you want to call it that, of the late 19th century, that we had yet enshrined the business firm as the primary engine of economic coordination and production. That just wasn't the case yet. There were all kinds of other associations. Economic production was more complex. We know this
history. And okay, so to say the middle part of the story a little bit, I think that the transition, and many people have, of course, noted this in other ways, but it's usually noted in terms of people embraced, that big is efficient in the progressive era. And I think that's, with the exception of maybe Brandeis and a couple of others, I think that's basically right. But I think the even more fundamental point is that the progressives, big P progressives, embraced the business firm as the gold standard in the hierarchy of economic coordination. And I don't think that was the case before. And I think that they did that very much not as part of a plot or conspiracy, very much a part of this, this narrative of unfolding progress. And it wasn't just those sort of like the liberal elite middle class progressives who did this. There were socialists who did this. Eugene Debs, in some of his writings, did this. And I think that there was really a notion at the time, in those decades before the New Deal, that that people were convinced by the idea that there are efficiencies that are embodied in the business firm, these economies of scale that we can almost sort of deductively assume that they exist, and then the progressive and socialist side of that is that we can harness those for the public or for workers. And I think that we can go more into the argument, but I think the point and the commonality that I think I see is that this was, I think, genuine belief, right? I think it was maybe not right, but I think it was genuine belief. I don't think it was sort of selling out to capital or selling out to property or selling out to the employer. And I think that's evidenced by the fact that it couldn't be reduced to sort of how, to the level of radicalism exactly. So I think that we then see this pass into the New Deal settlement itself. It's in antitrust law and in other areas, but also I think it's in labor law in various ways. And I'll maybe just briefly describe how I see it. We, today in some of the labor policy debates that we're having, we talk about, and obviously this was also discussed in Karl's paper and earlier, the fork in the road between enterprise bargaining and sectoral bargaining, right? But there's, I think, and that is really important as a practical matter, because having a common wage, as the labor institutionalist Sidney and Beatrice Webb called it back in the 1890s, the device of the common rule, having that reach sector-wide, really market-wide, whatever the reach of the market is essential to make collective bargaining efficacious, right? So, and we achieved that in de facto ways in the mid-century period through multi-employer bargaining, obviously, even if we didn't have formal sectoral bargaining. But conceptually, there's a prior question, or there's a way of just slightly at a diagonal reframing the question, where enterprise bargaining, it's not just enterprise bargaining versus sectoral bargaining, but enterprise bargaining versus non-enterprise bargaining. And so obviously this could include all kinds of other formations that cut across firm boundaries. And just briefly, this is an audience that one doesn't have to convince, but I often say this to antitrust audiences, but it's worth just doing this thought experiment between how labor unions are formed and how business firms are formed. And this is something that already exists at the beginning of when the Wagner Act is created, right? And that is that there is a public process of constitution that is just not the case for business firms. It's already incorporation as of right at that point. It's conceived as basically, as in the New Deal settlement itself, it's sort of seen as de facto, for practical purposes, of a creature of property and contract. And, we have some minimal securities regulation, but the process of constitution is you file a paper with the state secretary of state. It's, students learn that. Meanwhile, in labor law, we spend weeks of the semester, talking about how the Constitution occurs, and moreover, that the organization process is fundamentally derivative of the firm structure, which exists in both practical and conceptual terms in a prior way. And I don't think that this is something we can just reduce to sort of property or capital versus labor. I think it is something that sort of is this legal consciousness that permeated across areas of law and that I think solidified in the New Deal settlement. But I think it happens even before some of the bad law, and obviously before Taft-Hartley and all of that. And then it has lots of consequences, so that even in the height of, in Republic Aviation, we have, which we'd like to recapture fully, right? Even there, we have Section 7 rights defined fundamentally the way that the court says property rights, but it doesn't actually make any sense from a corporate law perspective to assert property rights over the physical plant. And right, I mean, shareholders have no control over that. They have absolutely no control rights over that. If the enterprise owns the physical plant, yes, and has control rights, but workers are part of that enterprise. So labor law itself is autonomously creating its own notion of default intra-firm coordination. It's trying to outsource it to things like property and corporate law, but actually it's creating its own sense. I mean, does that make sense? And then saying, but we're going to modify that and give workers some rights. But the thing I just want to point out, this is there's versions of this happening in antitrust. There's other, in corporate law in various ways. But labor law is really contributing to this itself, right? And in a way, in a stronger and even less coherent way than is happening in corporate law and antitrust law. And so that. We'll stop there, but that was sort of, an example of an application that I think is continuing the methods that we see in the seminal paper, and that I think is also hopefully capturing the spirit of this. It's not all a conspiracy. It's not all, reducible to sort of these clear class formations outside the law. The law is, nor is it not interacting with those things, right? I mean, clearly people who are empowered already by the law are able to influence the direction of the law in the future. And, but this legal common sense really exerts so much influence in the decade. We can reframe, I think, some of the bad decisions as extensions and distortions of this basic genetic defect. So I think I'm going to stop there because I feel like I'm a little over, and then maybe we can talk about the other stuff. But I actually, let me say one more thing, which is how I came to meet Karl super briefly. And I think, haven't known him for the years that many of you have, but in the few years that I have known Karl, I've been impressed by blessed by the same generosity of spirit that you all have described over decades. And I was telling my brother on the way over here, on the way to the airport yesterday, that about 3 years ago, I got an email in my inbox and it said Karl Klare, and I had this moment of mental confusion because I was like, wait, is the subject line Karl Klare? No, it's from Karl Klare. That can't be right. And my brain couldn't quite digest it. And he had, read a comment or something that I've written and had had all these amazing, and then had, I think, gone and read another draft paper and had all these amazing, generous comments for me. And it was just really made such an impression on me. And I think it is really, really, and then of course we become, he's been a wonderful, wonderful mentor to me since in my junior years. And, but I think it's just so of a piece with everything else I hear from everyone and from his former students. So I just wanted to add that anecdote. Thank you so much for having me here.
So I too am so deeply honored to be here, not just on this panel of luminaries and not just and to celebrate Karl and to honor him, but there's something I can't quite haven't articulated for myself yet, but I'll try. When I walked into the room earlier, I was struck by the energy. I have been to many talks in the last month, 12 to be exact, and none have been as well attended as this one, and none have felt as beautiful. And there's something in here about that that I think really speaks to Karl, but also transcends Karl, about the academy, about love, about solidarity that Karl often brings out in spaces that I want to honor and comment on. This is a really special, we've created a really special space today. So in preparing my comments, I had the opportunity to think back at my first encounters with Karl Klare's work almost a decade ago. I was a graduate student at UC Berkeley, a former public interest attorney, and I was studying a century of taxi worker organizing using both legal history, labor archives, and ethnography. And though I was specifically interested in the impact of progressive mobilizations of law in either sort of facilitating or inhibiting labor organizing over time, the classic law and society question, I myself knew very little about labor unions or the labor movement. This was in large part because of the time of my birth. If I can reveal that, I was born in the early 1980s, not exactly the height of the labor movement. Also to Indian middle-class parents who didn't sort of expose me to the larger discussions of social justice in the US, but also because I had long been interested in the immigrant-dominated service economy, a place with minimal labor union presence. And over the course of my graduate fieldwork, I had accumulated a whole trough of data from historical archives and years of ethnographic field notes. But as I struggled to write my dissertation, as one does, I realized how little I knew about labor law history. How could I begin to make sense of my research, my frankly sociological research, without the larger historical backdrop? And so I stopped typing and started reading, much to the dismay of my committee. So Karl's famous article, which you've now heard about, the judicial de-radicalization of the Wagner Act, written some 3 decades before I encountered it and some 3 years before I was born, became the single most influential piece of legal history and labor law scholarship that I read during that time. Reading it again as I did for today's panel, I'm struck by how prescient Karl was, writing in 1977-78 about the roots of the decline of labor unionism and of independent rank and file agitation more broadly. For me, as with so many other labor scholars today, Karl's central insights and understandings of judicial interpretations of the NLRA have become almost second nature, as Sanjukta alluded to. And truly, there is nothing more that any of us could wish for our own scholarship, that we, like Karl, make our arguments so clearly, so convincingly, and so compellingly that over time they seem instinctive instead of learned. Karl made the central point in this article, as many of you know, contrary to the traditional materialists of the time, that the Wagner Act was not in and of itself a state tool to de-radicalize the labor movement and to promote business interests at the expense of worker liberation. It was not the written law that led to this outcome. And indeed, he makes the claim that the NLRA, when passed, was a radical win, a capitulation by the state to labor amidst massive agitation. But he asks, for all of its liberatory potential, how is it that the act did so little to enhance the role of the working class in decision-making regarding the use of society's means of production and the organization of the work process? And in examining the first few decades of the Supreme Court's decisions on the Wagner Act, Karl found, as you all know, that it was the court and not the Congress that turned to contractualism to make sense of the relationship between labor and capital, rejecting any inference that the law would or should inquire into the substantive justice of labor management relations or the fairness of the wage bargain. And it was therefore the court and not the act itself that legitimized the inequalities of bargaining power and the unequal social distribution of property ownership. And it was the court and not the Congress, at least until the passage, of course, of Taft-Hartley, that drew the boundaries of what types of labor activities were considered legitimate, therefore not only shaping and limiting the actual transformative direct actions of labor unions, but also shaping their own political analysis and self-conceptualization in relationship to the broader polity. And for me, this was and continues to be a critical understanding for making sense of the present and the future of the labor movement. Many union leaders came to understand their unions not as vibrant and evolving structures that were growing a radical class-based movement, but rather in striking contrast to the views of their rank and file members as responsible political institutions that often reproduced rather than eliminated the alienation that characterized the work process. This also, in my mind, helped to explain parts of the labor movement history that I found stunningly at odds with my own politics of liberation as a post-colonial subject, including the role of US union leaders in participating in the US imperial project during the Cold War under the guise of international labor solidarity. And for me, these central insights about how the courts had essentially defanged this radical law helped to put my research in broader perspective. For example, it helped me to understand how the chauffeurs union in California, which represented taxi workers, was slowly seen as in bed with yellow cab in the decades following the National Labor Relations Act, owing, of course, to a number of cultural and political factors, but also in response to the possibilities and parameters of unionism set out by the Supreme Court. It helped me to understand, at least partly, why it was that so many taxi workers felt enormous discontent and alienation from their union. So much so that by the late 1970s, when given the choice, they chose an independent contractor contract and to opt out of the one bargained for by the union, leading to the entire deunionization of the industry and to the rise of precarious and unstable working conditions that have only grown in contemporary times. And Karl's arguments have continued to be a touchstone for me as I think through any number of issues in my current research on workers whose relationship to the NLRA is ambiguous at best. Today, as many of you may know, I continue to study the collective organizing of ununionized workers whose status as employees who have the protected right to organize under the NLRA is contested by capital. These workers, namely Uber and Lyft drivers, but also food delivery workers like Instacart shoppers and DoorDash drivers, have, like Karl, maintained faith in the possibilities of radical law and radical lawyering to support their organizing. Indeed, Karl has observed in other influential writing that contestation over legal rules and practices, like judicial contestation over the Wagner Act, actually opens up transformative practices if the contestation addresses not only liberal legal rights, but also structures of equitable distribution. While there are strong arguments made by friends and allies who I deeply admire that law is simply a tool of class oppression, that it fundamentally unequally distributes power, and that it should be disregarded when thinking about justice and transformation, what Karl has taught me both in his labor law scholarship, but also in his critical legal studies scholarship, is that rules and legal categories penetrate every level of our society. And the question is not, does law matter or should we use it? Which were frankly the questions I was asking at the beginning of my dissertation writing. But in the context of class struggle, how does law matter and how do we use it? Even if by using it, we mean existing and agitating outside of it and in opposition to it. Workers in my research, despite being victims of judicial retrenchment of the last many decades, of being deprived of the basic rights embedded in the NLRA, constricted by court interpretation, understand the law dialectically in the context of the worlds and work in which they labor and the ones that they are striving to build. They, like Karl, believe that institutions and practices produced by the law must be reconstructed through contestation. And in the course of this contestation, which I've seen most clearly through one-on-one conversations amongst workers, liberatory politics become possible. And in these troubled times, this is where I put my hope for transformation. Before I end, I want to make a few personal observations about Karl. It is rare in the legal academy to find both brilliance and humble kindness in one person. I think you all will agree. Karl is not just a radical labor law elder, he also continues to be a forceful thinker, embracing projects of the contemporary generation of new legal thinkers, helping us, pushing us, and supporting us through inclusive kindness, completely undeserved modesty, and deeply felt support and love for us and our strivings for better worlds. It is not until this very day that I have been in Karl's physical presence. And yet he has been in my mind and my heart for a decade. And there is something deeply, deeply beautiful about that.
We're going to turn to Diamond.
She's on the screen up there, but I don't know. You just need to go to view. Speak.
When she needs to. Diamond, can you unmute?
I am unmuted, hopefully.
Okay, well, we're good then. You can go ahead.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
We can now.
Great. I'd like to start by saying thank you so much to Dean James Hackney, Professors Libby Adler, Jeremy Paul, Lucy Williams, and also Emily Spieler for organising today and organising this panel. And obviously, mostly thank you so much to Karl. I am so sorry. What we say over here is I'm absolutely gutted that COVID has struck. And that means I was all set to fly this week and I haven't been able to. So I'm really, really sorry not to be there in person. So we've been asked to talk on this panel on unions and workers' solidarity forever about the predictive power of Karl's insights. And I think those insights also speak to and cast light on worker organisation in other industrialised economies, not just the US, other industrialised economies of the global north. So in my intervention, I'll explore collective organisation among non-standard, precarious and racialised workers in the United Kingdom. But first, and I'm going to share my screen. I hope everyone can see that. Slideshow, Labour of Love, yeah. Good, okay. First, I'd like to say something about the context in which I first met Karl 26 years ago, and my own engagement with his labour law scholarship, which has influenced my research and my observations, both specifically today, but also my broader research on the role of labour law and today the power of collective organisation. So this image is of a Deliveroo driver, and I realise I should perhaps have had an image of a DoorDash rider or an Uber Eats rider, but you get the idea. My PhD thesis was undertaken at the European University Institute in Florence, and you have just seen a short presentation from Professor Silvana. So my PhD was on labour law economic theory and the European employment strategy. My supervisors were Karl and Silvana, and as you know, she's now a judge of the Constitutional Court of Italy. Karl came on board because at the time he was visiting the European University Institute as a Fulbright scholar during my first year in 1998. So this is the context in which we were having these intense discussions about labour law, and it's the ideal context, like to study and research and think about labour law, deliberate on. So the thesis was a critique of economic analysis of labour market regulation in the context of the European Union's labour law and employment policy. Karl and Silvana significantly helped me clarify what it was I really wanted to say. I thought I wanted to talk about globalisation, I thought I wanted to talk about everything, and just that focus and helped me to pinpoint what it was I was really interested in was enormously valuable. There was a comparative element. I was interested in interrogating myths embedded in the discourse around labour market flexibility among labour economists, policymakers, legislators, and concerned about high unemployment in Europe. They looked with envy at the achievements of the comparatively unregulated US labour market. So it was obviously enormously helpful for me to have these conversations with Karl about to help me critique those assumptions about how institutions and legislative interventions, which figure so prominently in European economies, were somehow critiqued as impeding the ability of the labour market to clear, and that market equilibrium in Europe could be restored by deregulation following the US model. So I actually first met Karl a couple of years earlier at the second of the meetings of Intel, the International Network on Transformative Employment and Labour Law, which Michael has talked about, but which obviously Karl was co-founder and co-secretary. Intel 2 was at the University of Kent Law School, where I now work, and that was in 1996, and it was one of my very first scholarly presentations. I've put here a poster from Intel, subsequent Intel conferences, Intel 6, which was the University of Catania in Sicily in 2002. You can see here a list of the participants. I'm sure, I know quite a few of you are physically present now at Northeastern. I'm so sorry that I can't be there. And then this is Intel 8, the final Intel in Cuernavaca, Mexico, on globalization. Does globalization make labour law obsolete? With particular focus on a new opening to the left in Latin America and the role of labour movements in that. So what I would say is I think I'm able to trace much of my evolution as a labour law scholar through conversation with Karl in person and through his written work. So this is us having a heated conversation, but no doubt about how autonomous labour law really can be, on the street of Upper West Side when I was visiting Columbia Law School in 2007. So these comparative conversations, I've come to see the commonalities in the extent to which labour law can be said to be either autonomous from or perhaps yet another instantiation of the economic context of a market economy, which is increasingly subject to market fundamentalism. And it's that balance, how cynical are we going to be? What I find, what is perhaps equally, if not more important, that I've learned from Karl, which I hope I bring to my own practice as a colleague, a mentor, a PhD supervisor, is the way in which Karl has modelled what it means to be a normatively committed, yet intellectually open and non-hierarchical academic. So here, the final picture is of Karl with my parents. He just recently retired from over 30 years working as psychiatric nurses in the National Health Service in the UK. They've been very active in the Healthcare Workers Union and naturally found lots to talk about with Karl. Just this final point about Karl's modelling what it means to be a good academic, best practice as a scholar. So this is another image from the very hardworking Intel 8 in Cuernavaca, Mexico. Here with the long hair and the pink dress is Ruth Dukes. Later on, I organised a colloquium where Karl was a very important participant on Ruth's award-winning monograph, The Labour Constitution, the Enduring Idea of Labour Law. And here is Karl's contribution to that symposium in the Journal of Jurisprudence. He was, as ever, intellectually generous and very supportive, whilst also providing really constructive criticism of one's work. Okay, what I want to turn now to is continuing these comparative conversations, and I want to focus on decollectivization. So I'm thinking about the insights that I had a look again at Karl's Wagner Act article. So what I'd like to do with the remainder of my comments is to continue this comparative conversation, to trace the resonances between the US and the UK. So the decline of collective bargaining model that prevailed mid-century, the decimation of union membership and collective bargaining coverage, but its possible resurgence. So just recently, just now, Vina Duval talked about the research she's undertaking, and Michael referred indirectly to the successes of the Amazon Labour Union. And so I'm also interested in the possible resurgence of collective organisation through new, radically imaginative forms of union organising and mobilisation from amongst those workers who've been historically excluded from the standard narrative of trade unionism. So a narrative which is familiar to those of us who study industrial relations and labour law in the UK context is one of decollectivisation, precipitous declines in trade union density and collective bargaining coverage from what you can see here on this graph, the dizzy heights of the 1970s. So what happened in 1979, I wonder. First of the long era of conservative governments led by Margaret Thatcher. So Karl interrogates some of the rationales motivating the Wagner Act, albeit prior to it being defanged, a concern to achieve industrial peace, minimizing economically inefficient industrial action, promotion of collective bargaining in part as a means to mediate industrial conflict, in part so as to support collective regulation of terms and conditions of employment, to address the egregious inequality of bargaining power between capital and individual workers, in part to promote industrial democracy. This is a familiar story in the UK context as well, though rather than being achieved through a comprehensive statutory enactment like the Wagner Act, designed to formalise trade unions and establish a stable understanding of what in the 70s and 80s we called corporatism, instead the UK model has been marked more by an ambivalence about the role of statute in regulating labour. So in the immediate post-war era, collective social partners were to some extent left to their own devices. So it's a sort of laissez-faire system, we call it collective laissez-faire, where responsibility for standard setting and determination of terms and conditions of employment lay with the collective parties rather than with government. But to that, subsequently there was an era of regulatory intervention, which was marked though by simultaneous decollectivization and individualization. So simultaneous commitment to the reduction of the power of trade unions in the workplace and within industrial relations in general, at the same time an enactment of individual employment rights, in particular equality rights, and some of those were in part in response to the need to meet the requirements of European Union membership. This commitment to decollectivization has had a marked impact. The UK has a doggedly determined array of anti-union legislation, in particular during the long durée of Conservative governments from 1979 under Margaret Thatcher, reversing statutory support for collective bargaining, empowering employers to resist trade union demands, incrementally restricting the lawfulness of industrial action. These legislative interventions operate in parallel with wider labour market changes, some of which were equally facilitated by government deregulation. So the composition of employment has shifted away from more highly unionised sectors to traditionally non-union sectors and workers. Labour markets have become increasingly internationalised as trade has liberalised, immigration has increased, and capital markets have taken on a more global structure. So, as you can see, interesting comparison, this table from the UK is 1892 to 2020. The table I've got here from the US is 1890 to 2016. Sorry, very similar stories that have been told by these graphs. But what has been observable in recent years has been in the UK, I think, as well as the US, a counter movement, but an emergence or re-emergence of vocal trade unionism by workers in these very sectors, which have been restructured by capital, in large part the restructuring taking place so as to avoid the strictures of employment protection legislation and collective organisation. So this is the way we tell the story, that there's been a close affinity between the protections offered by the standard employment relationship, the coverage offered by collective bargaining, the safety net created by the post-war welfare state, which provided, for instance, income replacement during periods of unemployment, social security and old age. So my assessment of this story is that the social solidarity, which was to some extent engendered by and deemed necessary for the project of post-war reconstruction after the Second World War, arguably built on a wartime sense of national unity. So we now have a story, and this will be familiar to those of you in the US, which is that solidarity is weakened by an undue focus on identity politics, an undue focus on gender and race. So there is an argument, though, that the post-war solidarity, which was facilitated the building of the systems of collective bargaining and welfare state, entailed a conception of nationhood, which possibly carries an imperialist or racist rationality into the labour market. Race and racism were historically a structuring force within the working class in the UK, but in a slightly contradictory way. So on the one hand, one could say the working class has not wholly embraced a national identification with Britishness to the exclusion of non-native workers. And indeed, there was a multi-ethnic formation of the working class from its inception in the UK, comprising Irish Catholic, Jewish, Asian and African diaspora workers. So for example, Satnam Virdi uncovers a long tradition of cooperation and solidarity that often transcended racial and ethnic boundaries. But at the same time, though, in the context of the welfare state settlement, in the context of union organisation at its peak, there was hostility on the part of trade unions and on the part of the white working class to racialise others and migrants. So we do need to interrogate how inclusive of racialised workers and colonial subjects were the labour market institutions which comprise the foundation of the industrial citizenship of collective agreements, social security. Simon Deacon and Frank Wilkinson, for example, outline the very partial and uneven, fragile and incomplete quality of regulation through collective bargaining. And as with access to benefits of the welfare state, collective bargaining coverage was partial even during its peak, and that unevenness has historically been gendered and racialised. So universality required belonging or participation in the labour market, ideally in the primary labour market. Racialised and migrant workers in the UK, particularly those contracting for work under what we'd now call atypical or non-standard terms, were traditionally excluded from the industrial citizenship or social citizenship of the post-war welfare state. Similarly, in terms of gender, Sandra Fredman and Judy Flood remind us that the countervailing workers' power, the counterbalancing of the inequality of the individual employment relationship through collective action, is an option which has until recently been far less available to women workers than men, with women located in work which has been challenging for trade unions to organise or not fully recognised as work, given its close proximity with social reproduction. So collective bargaining, individualised employment rights, universal welfare state provision has been partial. That exclusion has been further exacerbated by growing informalisation and flexibilisation of labour. We have a number of interrelated factors: privatisation of the public sector, deindustrialisation, the rise of the services economy, decline of trade union power, employer preferences for flexibility, the inventiveness of platform capital have meant a shift towards work which departs sharply from the standard employment relationship. And that shift towards non-standard and more flexible contracting for work has in large part been facilitated by state deregulations. The state has not been absent. So we've seen employers and holders of capital increasingly organising production through distancing strategies, encouragement of labour flexibility in the private sector, distancing strategies such as subcontracting, franchising, concessions, outsourcing, where the employer contracts out the work rather than using its own workforce. This shift is manifested across all industrial sectors, but is particularly prevalent in the service sector, retail workers, catering, hospitality workers, home care workers, delivery drivers, security officers, most of whom are working non-standard arrangements, many precarious, many exploitative. Now, this retreat from the standard employment relationship has had differential impacts. but possibly disproportionately affected racialized groups. As Aaron Kandani contends, the privatizing of public life that neoliberalism engenders has racially disparate consequences due to the past history of racially differentiating discriminatory treatment. What I want to focus on just the final couple of minutes is new forms of worker organization. In two recent papers, Manos Diaz-Abi in one paper and Alessia Bertolini and Ruth Dixon in another talk about the varieties of strategies adopted by unions which classify themselves as traditional and alternative or indie on behalf of precisely these non-standard workers, in particular in platform-mediated work. Organizing, worker mobilization, collective bargaining, strategic litigation, and involvement in policy or lawmaking. Manoj has written about the surprisingly prominent use of litigation strategies by indie unions. Surprisingly, because indie unions tend to have a more radical orientation, but there is this interesting dual strategy, which I see a lot of resonances with the work of Karl and Vina mentioned just now, combining worker activism, worker mobilization, political theatre, community-based organising around language and migration status. So it's interesting that this new wave of union activism in the UK has been driven by unions representing and led by workers who were excluded from unions at the heights of trade union density in the 70s. So I'm just going to give this example here of the Independent Workers' Union of Great Britain, IWGB, which describes itself as a grassroots member-led union fighting for justice for workers. So the University of London and its constituent colleges and institutes such as SOAS, University College London, the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies, makes extensive use of contracting with sourcing companies to provide services rather than directly employing, for instance, security officers, maintenance workers, cleaners, porters, and this highly racialized workforce with high proportions of migrant workers. So the IWGB was founded in 2012 by Latin American cleaners organized for better working conditions. I seem to be following the union around. So when I worked at SOAS, this is where they were beginning their campaigns justice for cleaners employed at SOAS. I then moved to the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies, where they were also advertised at this part of University of London. This is Senate House, which is the University of Advanced Legal Studies. IWGU members focus on the Tres Cosas Three Things campaign to gain closer parity with in-house staff on sick pay, pensions, holiday entitlements, 40 months of demonstrations, student sit-ins, strikes, copious use of social media, 1,400 emails sent to members of the public. University Vice-Chancellor effectively capitulated and they won on the Three Cosas issue. After a 10-year campaign, they won on this issue of being brought in-house, the cleaners and also the porters. The campaign consisted of strike action, public protests, including in 2019, the biggest strike of outsourced workers in UK higher education history. The campaign continues. My conclusion is that some of these imaginative tactics and strategies which the IWGB has utilised may sound familiar. And here again, I found resonance in the work of Karl. For example, his paper Towards New Strategies for Low-Wage Workers, identifying weaknesses of traditional union organising efforts among low-wage workers, we need to revitalise links between labour and other social movements, in particular poor people's alliances, and to think also about less formal, less hierarchical, more rooted in communities forms of organising, which have been possible, for instance, even in large unions such as the Service Employers International Union, which I've heard Karl talking about in the context of Justice for Janitors campaign. So I'll end on this point.
So for the time we have left, I'm happy to open up the floor to anyone. I'd like to ask Vina, though, if she'd like to talk a little, just very briefly about the work that you've been doing.
I don't so much want to talk about the work that I've been doing as I want to say something that I think is, he keeps using the term transformational, which of course Karl uses, but I think is really sort of hopeful and situates him intellectually, specifically in this moment with, what Diamond and Michael have referenced as sort of this historic David and Goliath sort of moment in which the small union ALU in Staten Island has voted to unionize an Amazon Amazon warehouse. So one of the things that Karl has thought about a lot and has articulated is that sort of the transformations that need to occur through and with law and structural change are not simply redistributive, but actually also shifts in ways of thinking through community. If that is paraphrased correctly, shifts in ways that we connect with one another, shifts in ways that we feel solidarity towards one another, and it cannot just be about wages and hours. It has to be about different types of interconnectedness. And just as an aside, my late brother wrote about the role of football clubs in Brazil as sort of replacing, in the context of neoliberalization, replacing the role of unions and of the state in forming these sorts of transformative solidarities. And it made me think about how, sort of Chris Smalls has been heralded in this context of the Amazon labor union as sort of a hero, but actually the union itself emerges out of an experiment that very much reflects a lot of Karl's thinking. During the pandemic, a number of workers across the country, somewhere between 20 and 30, formed what they called the Congress on Essential Workers. This included Chris Smalls, but it also included radical Black women like Adrienne Williams, who is an Amazon organizer in the Bay Area. It included Instacart drivers and Uber workers, but included a lot of people who were forced to work while the rest of us were sort of inside, shuttered from the virus, and who were working doing essential jobs. And what was sort of amazing to reference what both Sanjukta and Diamond articulated is that they did not connect to each other solely through working conditions or wages, that they connected to each other through new forms of identity, some of which were class-based, but also some of which were political and cultural. And they built relationships that essentially allowed the emergence of the Amazon labor union and its sort of subversive support for the ALU all over the country over the last many months. And so I want to underscore as we talk, it's inevitable here that we're talking about redistribution and in the context of labor law, but there's something else that Karl has really beautifully always, and more recently in the work that I've read, never neglected. And it's also something that he embodies, which is that what we strive towards is much more than redistribution, but actually relations and relationships. And that is essentially what solidarity and transformation looks like.
Ingrid.
So again, I'm Karl's former student. I think that's really beautifully put. And I just wanted to follow up because I had a thought also from the women in the middle. I can't read your. And you talked about, I think that's very true. And I will tell this story about my Labor 1 class when I was in Karl's class, is that without telling us about any law review article, he definitely communicated that he did think that the Wagner Act was a radical act at the time, and that its promise was more than just redistribution. At least that's what I remember taking away from the way he framed the class. But I will say that I always was confused by that, because to me, the Wagner Act does also have a genetic defect from the beginning. And I think what all of your comments were very interesting in thinking about it. And it became something that I continued to think about after I was practicing and interacting with workers and committees and understanding how they understood their own rights in the workplace. But to me, the genetic defect is that the Wagner Act says, we give you wages and working conditions. The rest is up to us.
Yes. And he says that too. In the article.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Comments? I just want to say that the way I first came to know Karl's work was actually through graduates of this law school who were working in labor law around the country. And quite a few of the people in this room are included in that now. But in the early days, the person I came to know first was Judy Scott, who I think was with my practitioner hat on, was the most remarkable labor lawyer I ever knew, and was at the forefront of every reform movement of a major union during her entire working life, including at the forefront of thinking through the strategy for the fight for 15. And I believe that her conceptualization of these issues in the same way that I think Ingrid took it forward and all of the other labor lawyers in the room took it forward was deeply rooted, Karl, in the way you think about both about the law and about labor and about community. And so as I've come to know you, I've come to understand that better. But the reach of your teaching in labor law, and you'll hear from Dick Griffin, I think up on the monitor later today, has been extraordinary and deep, I think, throughout the labor movement. And one of the things that Karl and I talk about is the fact that Northeastern in particular has been a place to educate the future labor law leaders in this country on the progressive wing, and that it is really essential that it continue. I do remember that once when I was dean, that there were conversations among other deans about how labor law didn't need to be taught anymore, and that it has really declined in importance. Even work law has declined in importance outside the teaching of employment discrimination in the academy. And I think that the important role that Northeastern plays in this can't be forgotten, and that it's really rooted in the work that you've been doing all along.
I have a somewhat rare experience among labor lawyers. I'm the child of a factory worker, and I had the good fortune of having the opportunity to get a college education. People in my high school observed that I was better than most and capable and thought I should go forward. I've been working since I was 11 for local merchants. But I did go to college, and then trying to decide between academia and law school. Law school was 3 years and a known debt. And the people I knew at Michigan who were graduate students who got their doctorate were going off to East Podunk. You know, the idea that they were going to be part of a continuing community of active, engaged minds began to be less confident. This is in the late 70s. In any case, I came here for law school. The idea that the faculty here had chosen to take a different tack on how to teach their students. And it was fundamentally, in my mind, grounded in respect. I was somewhat older than most of my fellow students, but the idea that all knowledge wasn't at the front, but as I had experienced as a college student, I was interested in what my fellow students thought, because we were all experiencing things for the first time, coming with different levels of experience or totally different kinds of experiences. And in law school, that seemed vital, because I'd become a labor activist at Michigan. I came to see some quandaries around that, challenges of organizing drives in the public sector, not just in the private. And my first tort, I was fortunately assigned to Karl Klare's tort class. And it wasn't a baking class, it was for real. It was about conflict between people and their aspirations and power structures. One of the first things he did was take the case book and point out to us how cases were reported. And he made the point, why isn't the person's full name there? The corporate entity's full name is there. Well, maybe, he revealed to us how the law cloaks the reality of what it's deciding simply in that device. Now, was it done by West Publishing? Maybe, I don't know. But he made the point, think about what you're reading, think about what you're seeing. And I guess a point in the context of relations, as a young person, my father's factory became unionized, probably when I was in elementary school. And it changed things dramatically because workers gained control over the amount of overtime that could be put upon them. And workers who are forced to work massive overtime have less and less opportunity to participate in their communities and even with their families. But the union that came in, that was accepted, had social events for the families. Twice a year, we had big union-based, a Christmas, it was a Christmas, obviously that it was not inclusive, and a summer party, picnic in a public park. Some of that eroded relatively quickly with suburbanization. This kind of core population where people lived relatively close to where they worked in the city. People didn't want to make the trip, whatever. Or sometimes we talk in the labor movement about the problem of success. People began to, all they could get was money, and they too began to pursue money primarily, as opposed to objective. In my experience, the thing employers fight is the lack of control. The idea that they have to give any kind of control over the people who do the work. We see that institutionally, the scholarship showed it as how in steelworking, they stripped David Brody's monograph, stripped that power away from the workers, or tried to strip it away. But these struggles reemerge right now.
There's no question about that.
It's glorious that it's happening.
They are reemerging and the courts still tip their hat a lot to managerial control.
Oh, absolutely.
You just didn't address what just a quick point, or I wanted to quickly address, what's that? Ingrid, sorry. And I guess I just want to make a quick pitch since this is a room full of some practicing labor lawyers, labor academics, and so maybe more to the recent graduates and the labor lawyers, which is that we have to take back business law because there's what's that? Yeah. I mean, because as Karl's work shows, as as your comment demonstrates, the courts did not have to take that direction with respect to wages and working conditions, even based on the text of the act, and they didn't have to do it based on property rights or some of these things are more. When you look at, the debates that are happening in business law, on the one hand, those are ossified as well, but there's nothing in corporate law that says that workers who are, according to Ronald Coase's theory of the firm, are inside the firm. So so there's no conception of property that clearly should say that they don't participate in firm-wide decisions. This also gets exported into the labor exemption case law. And so anyway, that's a little beyond the scope. But so just my little pitch is, and right now in corporate law, there's obviously this big debate about is it all about maximizing shareholder wealth? We have really pretty mainstream figures like the former Chief Justice of the Delaware Supreme Court saying, no, it's not, right? So I think we need to connect these conversations and should not assume that everything outside of labor law, we should question all of that as well, and then bring that questioning into labor law as well.
You tell people on streaming that
What?
tell the people on streaming that they will not be able to hear Duncan at lunch.
Oh, okay, I didn't know
Back
that.
at 2:15.
Okay, so we're about to break for lunch, and lunch is in the Commons, which is the basement room in this building. For those of you who are on streaming, we will be breaking and we will be back at 2:15.